Well, for today's lesson on neuroscience, I would like to talk a little bit about a concept that might seem a little bit abstract, but is important for understanding how the brain functions. So, I'd like to ask the question, how does one visualize the cognitive mode that the brain is in? And so, to describe a little bit more about what I mean by this, the brain exists in many different states and networks throughout the day. When you're stressed, your brain is going to be a lot more engaged cognitively to allow you to manage whatever it is that's stressing you. When you are daydreaming, though, you don't need as much cognitive engagement, and so your brain is going to allow for more imagination, creativity, and self-referential thought that doesn't have very much to do with what's happening physically in front of you. And so all of these different states that your brain passes throughout the day are very interesting because it reveals a lot about how your brain manages information and determines what type of thought you need to be in at the current moment. And so, before we start talking about the different modes that the brain is in throughout the day, I would like to introduce a neuroimaging technique called fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. And essentially, this neuroimaging technique uses magnetic fields throughout the brain to measure blood oxygenation as a proxy for brain activation. And so, when there's a particular part of your brain that's more active or more stimulated, it's going to need more resources and nutrients and oxygen so that the cells can be more metabolically active and support that increased activation. And so the assumption with fMRI, and it's a pretty good and well-founded assumption, is that if there is more oxygenated blood flowing to a certain region of the brain, then that region of the brain must be more stimulated and more metabolically active. And so essentially you get these very pretty graphs where you have a visual representation of the brain, but you can actually see which regions have more density of oxygenated blood flowing to them. And so you can actually visualize brain activation over time via fMRI. And the reason that that's important in a lot of studies is that, well, one, you can determine how the activity of the brain changes with various tasks, but for the purposes of this particular lecture, it's also important for understanding how the brain operates when it's in a quote unquote default mode and there isn't any one particular task that it's focusing on. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce one mode of activity that the brain is in, and it's the focus setting of the brain, the central executive network. And so the central executive network, or the CEN for short, is going to be engaged when you have a task in front of you that requires strict attention, focus, and intense cognition. So here you're going to think of things like when a math test is put in front of you or when you're taking the SAT. These are tasks that are going to require a more unified response in the brain for full focus and reasoning. So, within the central executive network, fMRI data has suggested incredible activity in these three regions. And these are just some regions that are part of the central executive network. There are others, but I chose to focus on these ones for today's lecture. So the first region that's incredibly important is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC. And so this is responsible largely for decision making related to executive functions. So think about how reasoning and things like your ability to manipulate information in your head in real time are going to impact your behaviors and the decisions that you make and the plans that you have. Um, to dive a little bit more into real-time reasoning, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is especially important for something called working memory. And working memory is your ability to hold information in your head in short-term memory and manipulate it in real time in order to make decisions based off of it. So, for example, when you're having a conversation with someone, that's an instance in which your working memory is engaged because you need to have enough short-term memory to actually recall what the person is saying, process it, and have some sort of emotional response to it determine how that might affect your plans, and also formulate a response to what they have just said. So, working memory is going to be really important for your ability to operate in real time based on the stimuli that you're receiving. Another important structure in the central executive network is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is also abbreviated as the ACC. This is going to be the part of your frontal lobe that's especially critical for things like social processing and social interaction, as well as learning and reward reasoning. And the reason that it's responsible for these two types of functions is that they're actually heavily intertwined, because learning and reward reasoning is going to largely motivate the way that you interact in a social setting. And so, for example, you might decide that when you're having a conversation with someone, you would want to compliment them so that you can form a relationship with them that you might benefit from in the future. And so, the anterior cingulate cortex is also going to be really important for your real time reasoning. Next, I'll talk about the inferior parietal lobe. And the inferior parietal lobe is part of the central executive network because it's sort of like a hierarchy manager for determining which tasks are especially important to maintain focus on. So, when, for example, just to continue using this as an example, you have a math test, the inferior parietal lobe is going to maintain your focus on the question in front of you so that you're not thinking about things like, oh, what you want to have for lunch that day, or that thing you have to do after school, or that homework you have for another class. You're solely focused on the math test in front of you. However, the reason that I say it's a hierarchy manager is that the inferior parietal lobe is subject to changing dynamics in that it can still filter out stimuli that are coming in to determine if any new stimuli are going to be particularly important. And so let's say that while you're taking your math test and you're incredibly focused on your math test, for some reason a grizzly bear walks into the room. Well, the inferior parietal lobe is going to intake that new visual stimulus and determine that that is, in fact, the more important stimulus to focus on. And so it'll switch your attention away from the math test and towards the grizzly bear and how you can escape from the grizzly bear. And so the inferior parietal lobe is juggling a lot of new stimuli to prioritize which ones you should be focusing on and keep your attention on those most important stimuli. And so here at the sides, you can see some fMRI images of regions in the brain that are particularly active when the central executive network is engaged. Next, I'll go ahead and explain the mechanics of the default mode network. As opposed to the central executive network, this default mode network is basically the mode that your brain goes into when you're at rest, and there is not any particular cognitive task that you need to be focusing on right now. And so this is yet another fMRI scan of the brain when the default mode network is engaged. And so you can see that it's pretty dispersed in that there are frontal lobe hubs involved, but there's also regions in the occipital lobe that are important in the default mode network. So I'll go ahead and provide a deep dive on how different regions in the default mode network are responsible for supporting these different functions. So within the frontal lobe, you're going to have the medial prefrontal cortex, or the MPFC. This is especially important for autoreferential or self-referential thinking. And so in this case, you're going to be reflecting a lot on yourself, maybe aspects of your personality or the way that you think. You're also going to be thinking a lot about your day and how you specifically interacted with other people and events that happened throughout your day. And so one of the critical functions of the default mode network is self-awareness and self-reflection. And so the reason it's so fascinating is a large part of your own consciousness of yourself as an entity in the world arises from the default mode network. Additionally, being a region in the frontal lobe, the medial prefrontal cortex is especially important for quick, intuitive, emotional decision making. And so, a lot of the way that you act in your specific personality and the way that emotions factor into your decision making are solidified because of the medial prefrontal cortex. Next, I'll go ahead and move on to the posterior cingulate cortex. So the posterior cingulate cortex is going to support the MPFC in this autobiographical or self-referential thinking by supporting episodic memory recall when it's appropriate. And so episodic memory is a type of memory that's unique to you because it's your memory of events that occurred in your life and the way that you specifically chose to react to different scenarios in your life. And so episodic memory recall is therefore going to be very important in your sense of self because it's important for constructing your actual identity and the way that you personally choose to respond to different things in your life. Additionally, the posterior cingulate cortex is responsible for daydreaming and related imaginative cognition. So that's the second important function of the default mode network. Largely daydreaming and focusing on sort of internal thoughts when there's no external cognitive task or pressing stimulus that needs your immediate external attention. Lastly, within the posterior region of the brain towards the occipital lobe, we have the precuneus. And so that's going to support episodic memory recall from a visual setting. So the precuneus is going to be responsible for almost being able to create movies in your head when you're daydreaming because it has this ability to support that episodic memory recall and daydreaming with visual stimuli and drawing on your visual experiences. And so the default mode network is particularly fascinating for things like daydreaming and being able to create pictures in your mind and have autobiographical thinking related to creating scenarios in your head. Now I'd like to address the question of how the brain actually knows when to switch between these two networks. So, how does the brain know when to engage the central executive network, which is going to be responsible for controlling the way that you respond to external stimuli and external cognitive tasks? And how does it go from that to the default mode network, which is going to be important for when you don't have any particular external cognitive task that needs your attention and you're sort of going inside your head and thinking inside your head? Well, the critical control room switch that balances the central executive network and the default mode network is a third network called the salience network. And so the salience network is especially important for how the brain actually constructs reality because it switches between a mode where you're intensely focused in the external world and another network where you're intensely self-reflective and thinking within yourself. And so the salience network starts with the midbrain, which is responsible for the early processing of auditory and visual stimuli. And then that moves to the thalamus, where these auditory and visual stimuli, among other types of sensory perceptions, are going to be relayed throughout the brain, specifically to the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for taking in those integrated sensory stimuli and actually creating perception and decision making based off of them. And then from the thalamus, you're going to have sensory stimuli relayed to two other critical structures in the salience network, the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And so the insula is going to assign relevance to the various stimuli that are received. And so by assigning relevance to the various external stimuli that are received by the thalamus, the brain can essentially decide how important it is to be engaged on the stimuli that are being presented to you externally, and it'll allow you to switch between the default mode network when, let's say, there's not a lot of important stimuli coming in. Then, well, maybe you can sort of have time for daydreaming and self-referential thinking and reflect on episodic memories of times when there were important stimuli. Then, on the contrast, the anterior cingulate cortex is going to take those stimuli in and direct attention to any stimuli that may have any emotional or physiological importance. So, for example, let's say that there's a grizzly bear coming towards you, and that grizzly bear is obviously going to have very important relevance for your physiological well-being. And so that's a instance of when the central executive network would need to be engaged to allow you to navigate that important external circumstance. But if the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex combined determine that there is not a lot of important external stimuli coming in, then, well, you're going to probably go into this default mode network. And so that is how the salience network ultimately balances the different modes that your brain can be in. And so this is just a quick overview of how your brain actually operates throughout the day and constructs your reality and determines the modes of thought that you fall into. Thank you so much for watching this lecture, and I really hope that you learned a little bit about how the brain switches between different modes of thought throughout the day.